Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sex and Sanctity. I am so excited that you decided to take my course. My name is Hannah Jones, and I'm going to be your instructor for this semester. I'm a PhD candidate in the history department, as well as the graduate fellow for SEAMers, and it is my sixth and final year in the department, which means that I will be defending my dissertation this fall. A lot of the ideas that we're going to discuss in this course actually have a lot of resonance in my research, and particularly my dissertation is on Clare of Assisi, one of the figures that you will be learning about in this course. So I'm really interested in the apocalyptic expectations of the 13th and 14th centuries, and in particular, the ways in which Clare's identity as a saint was constructed and deployed by the papacy and royal families as political propaganda. But I'm not just interested in this kind of top-down look at religious devotion and women's spirituality. I'm also interested in how women in their everyday lives interacted with the representations of Clare as a spiritual intercessor and used her as a model for the ways that they could also use their spiritual devotion and agency in society to really participate in the church and God's plan for salvation. I'm also very interested in the way that these women were living in conflict zones and they were really vulnerable to military violence. So Clare's representation as a saint perhaps gave them a model for dealing with those sort of anxieties and threats in their everyday life, particularly the ways in which she was described as being very militant and apocalyptic through her prayers. So I'm telling you all of this because this dissertation research really has a lot of the deals with a lot of the themes that you'll be discussing in the course. And I'm really, really excited to read your perspectives on all of the texts and get to know you all basically through your projects. So I hope that this course is exciting for you. And I think that my enthusiasm for the content will probably come through in the lectures. At the end of the course or by the end of the course, I really hope that you have a good, solid understanding of how Christian devotion evolved from late antiquity to the late Middle Ages, and how individuals' claims to spiritual authority were frequently based on contemporary understandings of sex and gender. So I'll get into what that means and a little bit more context for understanding the framework of the course. First, I'm going to go over the syllabus with you. So let's get into that. All right, everyone. So I wanted to give you a little look at the syllabus just to make sure that you don't miss any of the important information that it includes. So first things first, if you scroll down, it's important to take a look at how your grade is broken down. So this means that all of the percentages for your grade are totaled up here. And you can see that in order to earn a A on your final paper, you must address the feedback that's given on your draft. And that's part of why this class counts as a C for composition. The other important thing to note, well, obviously, is that I'm very open to office hours and I'm very open to helping you outside of office hours if that doesn't work with your schedule. So that is something to keep in mind. But also, my descriptions here of the weekly assignments will be very helpful for you. So make sure you take a close look at these. In particular, I want you to recognize that there is an order to how your assignments are listed, both in the syllabus and also on Brightspace. So the way that the assignments are set up in the syllabus is directly parallel to how you're supposed to engage with them on Brightspace. And what this means is that I expect that you will start each unit with a 30-minute lecture. And generally, this will give you the context for the readings and some historical background so that you can understand the ideas that come up in the texts. And then I want you to get directly into the primary sources. And from there, that is when you go into write your discussion board. And all of those things will be grouped together on Brightspace under primary sources. The second part of the week will be devoted to your secondary sources and putting the primary and secondary text together in a unique way. So, the reason that I asked you to read the primary sources before the secondary is that I want you to come into them with your own perspective, your own argument, and I don't want you to feel like you need to replicate the work of a scholar. basically. So I think that secondary articles and chapters are really good for supplementing your own opinions about the text, but I don't want you to go in and have kind of a predetermined conclusion about what you're going to find in those readings. So that is the logic for why you should engage with them in that order. And as I said, you can find more specific guidelines about the assignments here in the syllabus. You can also find a pretty detailed description of your research paper, which includes the prompt, as well as some guidelines for how to get started with your PowerPoint. Um, for that assignment in particular, there is a secondary assignment sheet that is available on Brightspace. And then this is also very important. I'm a big advocate of knowing what your grade is as you go. So I've included these rubrics so that after you do an assignment, in theory, you can grade yourself and you can see exactly what you're being graded on. So if there's ever a time that you feel your score doesn't reflect the work that you've done, you've compared your work to the rubric and you've come out with a different total, feel free to reach out to me and advocate for yourself. I'm never going to be upset at you for having an investment in your grade. So definitely, if it doesn't seem to be aligned with what the rubric is telling you, then definitely reach out to me. These rubrics are also meant to give you some, guidelines for really what to look for in your paper. I'm really trying to help you ensure your success in the course. And to that point, if you have any trouble with technology or if you need any help or accommodations, please, please, please let me know. And then finally, as mentioned, there is a schedule for your assignments, and all of these deadlines are put into Brightspace, but you can find them also here in the syllabus. And I tried to give you at the end of the schedule here the little bullet points so that you can see exactly what the due dates for everything are. Because this course is just 5 weeks, we have to pack a lot in. So I can understand that it might feel a little bit overwhelming at first. And hopefully, these assignment breakdowns and the schedule will help you stay on top of things. Obviously, things happen. So, if anything comes up this summer and it prevents you from meeting an assignment deadline or you need an extension for some reason, again, please do not hesitate to reach out. I'm always happy to help and accommodate you as much as possible. The main thing is that you don't want to fall behind in the course since it is just 5 weeks. So, try not to let your work build up, and to the best of your ability, let me know in advance if you'll need an extension so we can work out a plan for how you can move forward. But I think that's it. So let's move on now to some actual historical stuff. So, in this course, we're going to be talking a lot about Christian culture and devotion, but I don't want to assume that you're coming into this course with a pre existing understanding of what Christianity even is. So, there's probably going to be terms that you're unfamiliar with, and I want to give you a foundation for getting started and just kind of a basic framework for understanding the arc of this course and the issues that we're going to be thinking through. Many of the definitions that I'm going to give you in this introductory lecture come from these really short, concise essays by the late Thomas Head, and I would be more than happy to send you those essays if you would like a little bit more context to get you started. But in the meantime, please listen to this little lecture and really think about the terms that I'm giving you because they're going to be reoccurring throughout the course. And in particular, they're going to be showing up in the readings that you do for Unit 1. So when we talk about the church in the medieval period, we're talking about the Western institution that is really centered around the papacy or the Bishop of Rome. And this is as opposed to a singular church that might be just located down the street, which would be a lowercase c. So we're thinking about the specific institution of the Western Church that really develops throughout the medieval period and becomes centralized around the Bishop of Rome. And so as the Bishop of Rome takes on more power, eventually that they are able to claim the title of Pope. And we'll think a lot about that and get more into that context later. But basically, once the Pope is established as the center of the hierarchy, the kind of following positions below him become much more rigidly defined and regulated. And in turn, the private devotion of the everyday people becomes more regulated and defined as well. So below the Pope in this hierarchy are members of the clergy. And these are essentially men who have been ordained into the priesthood. So local people who are running their churches are priests, and then the people who are overseeing the more like the regional churches and people, bigger groups of people are bishops. And generally speaking, these are men who, because of their ordination, have the privilege to preach, to convert people to Christianity, to hear confessions, and essentially to control the church service. So in this sense, they're really functioning as the mediators between individuals and the community and God. And those individuals that I'm talking about are known as the laity or lay people, the everyday members of society that don't have positions of power in the church, but nevertheless are Christian and really are thinking deeply about their relationship with God. And in this relationship between the clergy and the laity, the clergy are really allowing the laity to connect with God through the sacraments, which are controlled by the clergy. So what is a sacrament? That is the Christian ritual that was viewed, the Christian rituals, plural, that were viewed as essential to entering heaven. So this is baptism, this is receiving the Eucharist, which is the Christian form of communion with bread and wine that's blessed by the priest during the church service. And it's also some things like confession. And so you can see how, in this sense, because of these rituals and the priest's control of those rituals, they're mediators in their communities for access to God. However, many saints actually begin their journeys as members of the laity, or rather, they begin their journeys without official status in the church institution. So everyday people without positions of power could nevertheless claim spiritual authority and significance in their own communities and claim to have a personal connection with God through their performances of sanctity. And in this sense, saints sometimes could rival the clergy in terms of their communal significance, which we will think a lot about. So that brings me then to the really big question that you need to know to get started, and that is, what is a saint? For medieval Christians, saints were really just holy people who, after their death, according to Christian theologians, were supposed to have entered heaven. And so, in practice, Christians in the community would only honor a limited number of people with the title of saint. So this was something that was seen as really hard to achieve, but something that everyday people should strive for and ideally emulate in their everyday lives. So crucial to the recognition of sainthood was the celebration of a feast, a church service, which marked the day of the saint's death. And so that day then was considered to be the person's birth into the kingdom of heaven. So it's a celebration of their death because it's a reminder to the community that they did everything right in their lifetime and they were able to go into that eternal paradise in the afterlife. So in practice, a person really became a saint only when he or she was accepted by their community, right? And that in particular, with the blessing of some sort of institutional authority. So they needed the support of their local priests, of their local bishops, and in general, they needed the public to agree on their holiness. In late antiquity and in the early Middle Ages, bishops controlled the celebration of saints' feasts, but there was not actually a definitive way of regulating who could be declared as a saint. So you'll see in the arc of this course, by the 13th century, the papacy or the Bishop of Rome really begins to assert his authority over the process of who can be declared as a saint and take that decision making away from the laity, and particularly make it so that The church itself, right, and the hierarchy of the church is more rigidly defined and regulated. So this process of declaring who can be a saint and the church taking ownership over the process of investigating claims to sanctity is known as canonization. And we will think about this arc of how we get there. Um, this is not to say that it ever becomes completely controllable by the church. Religious devotion to particular figures definitely continues, and the laity consistently have spiritual demands that they feel aren't being met by the clergy, which cause them to turn to their local figures and local saints. And so there's really was and is no universal authoritative list of Christian saints. And the aim of this course is really to show how the veneration of saints was really difficult to control at the local level, and the ways in which communities tended to honor local holy people, even if they didn't receive that endorsement from the Pope. But this practice of venerating local saints becomes increasingly contested. And by the end of this course, you'll see how standards of orthodoxy and really rigid definitions of who can receive visions from God create a lot of persecution that's directed toward women in particular. So we're going to chart the development of standards of sanctity by looking at hagiographic texts that are associated with saintly men and women. And hagiography, in this sense, refers to a wide range of Christian literature which concerns saints. So the scope of that literature is really diverse, and it includes genres such as lives of the saints called vita, collections of miracle stories, accounts of the discovery of saints' relics, papal bulls of their canonization, inquests or testimonies that are associated with the canonization to validate their sanctity, liturgical books, sermons, visions, the list could go on. But basically, these works were composed in order to promote that person's reputation as a saint and build up the public veneration. And these works were not only composed in the official kind of clerical languages of the Christian church, so Latin, but these texts start to appear in a wide range of vernacular languages as well. So regional languages like French and German and Italian that people spoke in everyday life. And that really communicates that these figures had like a real significance to their communities and to the laity, not just kind of idealized figures for the clergy to look to or to use as examples of perfection. So works of hagiography in this broad sense have been written by Christians from literally at least the middle of the 2nd century all the way to the present day. But the Middle Ages in particular were a really productive time for the construction of these narratives. And hagiographic texts from the Middle Ages remain really important for historians as sources because they give us evidence of medieval Christianity, but also of what society and social standards were normative, broadly speaking. So you're going to be looking at lots of different hagiographic texts in this course, a variety of different genres, and you're really going to be considering the historical context in which these texts were produced. In practical terms, the living holy man or woman really only gained recognition as a saint if they were accepted by their community of believers, and as I said, if they had some degree of clerical support. So the hagiographic texts also provide us with historical evidence of the ways individuals took on spiritual authority in their communities and received varying degrees of public honor after their death. So you will really be asked to consider the ways in which sanctity was a social construct and how the ideals and practices of sanctity changed really greatly and diversified over the course of Christian history. So we're really specifically interested in exploring the ways in which standards of sanctity or standards of spiritual perfection changed according to contemporary gender ideals and sexual ethics. The recognition of, or more importantly, the failure to recognize women as saints will be prominent in the second half of this course. And it really betrays many of the misogynistic traits typical of pre-modern society and culture. So while most medieval theologians conceded in theory that men and women had equal capacity to be saved by God and to enter heaven, they almost uniformly saw men as more likely to practice and embody the virtues necessary for sainthood. So more women are excluded from sanctity than men, generally speaking. And women across the board are excluded from positions of power in the church hierarchy. So you'll see there's a lot of religious experimentation that happens in female communities, and this really is growing out of their marginalization in the church. Throughout the Middle Ages, women actually were a distinct minority among Christians whose reputation for holiness received public celebration. And this sort of changes by the late Middle Ages, but we're going to be thinking about the arc of how female expression of religious devotion is really regulated to maintain the patriarchal nature of the church and of society, broadly speaking. So when reading these works of hagiography, I really want you all to keep in mind that the primary aim of the author is not to compose a biographical record of that person's life, but rather to portray their subject as an exemplar of Christian virtue. So in a few of the units, you're going to read writings of holy women themselves and think about their self-representation, but for the most part, our information on saints is going to be coming from the lens and perspective of the clergy or of the person, the priest that collaborated with that saint in their lifetimes. Sometimes the person maybe didn't actually know them very intimately at all. So in this sense, hagiographic texts really tend to reveal more about the religious and cultural world of the authors than specific facts about individual lives or the internal motivations of their subjects. Hagiographers really sought to show that the saints themselves had embodied Christian standards of spiritual perfection, particularly the standards that were provided by the life of Christ and previous saints. And so because they're trying to build up this universal model for how everyone should strive to achieve spiritual perfection, they're deploying kind of the same examples again and again, and they're reiterating the same themes again and again. And they're even employing like consistent literary models and motifs that come out of the Bible. And they're even taking stories from one saint's life and then adapting them for another. So basically, each hagiographer is really taking this kind of traditional source space of material and then adapting it for their particular audience. And this rhetorical strategy really highlights the moral and didactic function of the text. So I'm going to ask you to really think deeply about what standards of sex and gender are being communicated to the audience through these stories and why. What social anxieties, what contemporary fears are happening that are making them represent women or men in a particular way. So we can see new expressions of Christian devotion in the text when the authors elaborate on and sometimes alter the extant tradition by emphasizing new aspects of one's spiritual journey or devotional life that really, and we have to relate these kind of additions or alterations to the contemporary standards of the audience that they're trying to appeal to. So different models of sanctity emerge and reflect the diverse forms of Christian devotion that are likewise arising throughout the Middle Ages. And when I say models of sanctity in this context, I'm really referring to the way an individual's religious reverence or their piety and their particular practices associated with their religious devotion are being idealized. So the life of Christ in the Bible, the life of Jesus, I should say, in the Bible, came to be the standard for sanctity, kind of broadly speaking, but the imitation of Christ itself, the physical terms of what that means, were constantly changing according to contemporary gender expectations. So one person's understanding of Jesus is going to be different from another person in a different time period. And so all of the saints that you will read about in this course really understand themselves as imitating Christ to some degree, but their piety and corresponding models of sanctity look very different. Um, but across the board, we do see some common themes that reoccur. And in particular, you're going to be exposed to a lot of accounts of medieval saints or medieval holy women embracing various forms of bodily suffering. And this is in an effort to imitate Jesus' suffering on the cross. So some of the things that they would do include wearing hair shirts, flagellating themselves, fasting regularly, embracing physical torments, and so on. And this type of devotional practice based on self renunciation and self discipline is known as asceticism. So, the desert hermits that you're going to be looking at in the first unit are considered kind of the earliest forms of Christian asceticism. And moving forward, pious Christians across the board would use ascetic techniques to overcome physical desires associated with sin and thereby achieve a state of spiritual perfection. So, we're also going to be thinking about how religious devotion evolves over time and ascetic practices likewise evolve. So I hope all of that context gives you a framework to get started with your readings. And before I let you go, I just want to give you a little timeline of the arc of the course so you can see where we're starting and where we're going. And also remember to pick the saints that you're going to be using in your final paper. Okay, so here are the saints that we will be covering in this course. Check out the list. Definitely pause this video so that you can see the dates and kind of have a list to go off of when you're thinking about who you want to write about for your final paper topic. Don't forget to do the Unit 1 discussion board post as well as the icebreaker for Unit 0. Okay, happy reading this week.